Welcome to this glyphosate stewardship and resistance briefing update. Thank you for joining us today. Just to confirm that what we'll be talking about is about minimising resistance development, and we have on the call key representatives from the press and technical leads and influencers within AIC and AICC in particular. Also a reminder, please, if you do wish to ask a question, and there will be a Q&A panel at the end, please could you do so through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. That is much more helpful to us than if you use the chat one. We'll try and monitor the chat, but it's not always there. And finally, that this meeting will be recorded or is being recorded for others to view later. If you have a problem with that, please could you dial off now, but it will be available. First of all, for those that don't know me, I'm James Clarke. I'm chair of WRAG, the Weed Resistance Action Group, and also the ADAS Research Director. On my left, I have John Cussans, a colleague from ADAS, who is a principal weed scientist who will be talking to you. And on my right, I have Roger Bradbury of Bayer, who will also be talking to you. So what I'm going to start by doing now, hopefully this will work, is to share my screen and a presentation which you should be able to see. So that is where we are. There is more information on our website, but also on our LinkedIn group, both of which are available on this and a few other slides later on. We are aiming to finish by 12:15, and we'll go through that. I'll say a little bit of introduction further than I have done. Then John is going to talk about the resistance status and the implications of that in the UK. Roger will talk more about glyphosate stewardship, and as I said, there'll be then Q&A and some remarks. So firstly, a little bit about Weed Resistance Action Group. For those that don't know, we're an informal group. We've been around since the late 80s. Independent, with a steering group with representatives of CropLife, that should say, apologies, and AIC member companies, but also organisations involved in herbicide resistance research, which includes people like ADAS, Rothamsted, including the regulator, various universities, colleges and AHDB, so some funders as well. And we normally have one or two steering groups a year. We will have open meetings when we need to. You can find out more about those and follow our activities on our new LinkedIn group. We also importantly maintain links with the national groups, the HRAC, Herbicide Resistance Action Committee, and the European equivalent of that. Our objectives are to provide a forum for information exchange between people involved in research, to discuss and promote strategies to avoid resistance, to define research needs, to discuss the test methodologies and agree standards, agree statements for the media, and also to maintain communications within the country, but also with other groups elsewhere. And that is exactly why we are here today, to talk more about some of the recent findings and what we think needs to be done. So I will tell you right at the outset that we are going to tell you about the first case of UK glyphosate resistance in Italian ryegrass. It is a high-risk situation, and despite investigating other cases, they were all well controlled at well-applied field rates. And this has been rigorously tested, as John will go into. We have not found any evidence of glyphosate resistance through the extensive surveys that have been done, and again, John will show you more about that. And we did identify populations which were high risk, but they in follow-up also were shown to be not resistant. We are still, though, investigating a very small number of other cases. What I want to highlight is that everything we say today is still summarised in the WRAG Guidelines. They were written about nearly 10 years ago now. They are still the document. They were well informed by both AHDB research, but also industry-funded research. Many of the companies involved in that are listening in today. And the key management within that is about preventing survivors, maximising efficacy, using alternatives and monitoring success. And we will make no apologies for repeating those four phrases several times through this call. So I'm going to hand over now to John, who will tell you a bit about the resistance testing that we've done, how we've identified this sample, and what the implications of that are. John.
Thanks, James. Yeah, so a little bit of background, I guess. It's important to put this in context. We have, as James has implied, understood that there are high-risk uses of glyphosate, but also that there are glyphosate-resistant cases globally, and specifically there are glyphosate-resistant cases in Italian ryegrass, Lolium multiflorum. And we have identified Italian ryegrass as being a particularly high-risk situation for some time now, and you'll see in a moment how we've really built up the level of monitoring and testing reflecting that risk. In particular, it's worth pointing, I think, to the fact that there are actually 2 cases of glyphosate resistance in Italian ryegrass on the European continent. One was reported in Italy and one was reported in Spain. And these date back to around 2006, 2012, in very similar cropping systems to our own. So again, just feeding into this picture that there clearly is a risk and has been a risk, specifically in Italian ryegrass. And add to that some work that we did supported by Bayer Crop Science a few years ago. When we take collections of Italian ryegrass populations that have been collected ostensibly for other reasons, so actually to look at in-crop herbicide resistance, and then we screen those for glyphosate as a second step, we can see that there is already, or there was already, back in 2019, 2020 when this was done, very considerable differentiation, differences in herbicide sensitivity between ryegrass populations, demonstrating not just a theoretical risk because of the international picture, but an actual risk in UK populations of selecting for changes in sensitivity to glyphosate. There's a red reference population in there to the left-hand side of the graph. This is a known confirmed glyphosate-resistant case, in this case from Italy, which just puts that a little bit into context. We're talking about, from the vast majority of ryegrass populations, changes in sensitivity, shifts in sensitivity. This is not resistance that we're picking up in that kind of approach. And again, to give that a little bit of context across other grass weed species, at the bottom you can see a reflection of that previous data. When you screen a large number of Italian ryegrass populations, you can say that there's roughly a 5-fold, 4.7, but roughly a 5-fold difference between the least and the most sensitive population of Italian ryegrass. There was some work done previously that showed in sterile brome, for example, you could observe something like a 3.4-fold difference between the least and the most sensitive. Another species where we want a good level of vigilance is Ratsdale fescue, Vulpia majorus, where, albeit at a low rate, there's a 3-fold difference. Just to make sure that we're not looking in the wrong place, or we're not focusing too much on species like blackgrass because they're problematic weeds. When we look at blackgrass populations, there's something like a 2-fold difference in sensitivity to glyphosate. So whilst we never say never, we are talking today about trying to focus in on risk and trying to inform better farmers so that they can think about what the risk is on their farm. And it is very much, as we're finding at the moment, around Italian ryegrass populations in annual arable crops. So, as I say, we have understood that there's a risk in glyphosate resistance in Italian ryegrass. There's a global picture. We can see changes in sensitivity in UK populations. And as a result, over the last few years, we have had a very high level of monitoring and screening. I've put together with my colleagues here at ADAS, Katie Hebditch in particular, but also work that I carried out when I worked at NIAB over the last few years. And I'm enormously grateful at NIAB to colleagues like Pete Baker in the Glasshouse Services team, who did an awful lot of the physical work around this, as well as my new colleagues in ADAS. But we have screened over 300 Italian ryegrass populations, submitted to the 2 organisations for routine testing or as part of larger surveys. And despite that level of monitoring, we have not identified a single Italian ryegrass population tolerant to glyphosate in this way. The way that we have identified this first case, so now we're moving on from a theoretical risk internationally, a risk that we can confirm through changes in sensitivity to glyphosate in UK populations, that triggers a screening campaign, to our first confirmed case of glyphosate resistance in the UK. The way that we have identified this case is by the agronomist on the ground, seeing the risks, seeing the indications, and engaging with research providers such as ADAS in this case to follow up and to understand what's going on. So what it looked like, or what it looks like in the field, this is an example photograph, is in this case in the preparation for a late spring crop. Glyphosate is used to prepare the field. We can see the level of survivorship of very healthy looking Italian ryegrass populations. The first step was to look at practice, rates, timing, water condition in this case, and all the practice that we normally want to look at when we see a failure of glyphosate in the field. But all of those things were ruled out in this instant, and that led us to some targeted sampling where we recovered plants from this field, took them back to the glasshouse and created a seed sample selected from that individual population in the field. And that initial screen, which is something we want to make use of a little bit more because it gives you a very fast indication of problems, did give us real cause for concern. So we have been back to this location in Kent and resampled several fields, and actually over 2 seasons now, most recently in the summer in 2024. And moving on from having that indication, that initial concern around the population, we do now have a field case, and that's an important distinction, because when we talk about field case, we're not talking about a few plants that we've recovered. We're talking about seed samples taken in the summer at the end of a crop life cycle, in this case multiple fields which are showing reduced activity or complete tolerance to label rates of glyphosate. On this graph, which is a little bit busy, so I've tried to pick out a couple of key rates. There's a black line, which is our sensitive standard. So you can see at low doses to the left-hand side, we've got high control at the top of the graph. When you contrast that on the right-hand side of the graph to populations such as the yellow line, which is one of the seed samples, the purple line, and so on, you can see that these are populations where we are achieving very, very low levels of control from the 540 gram rate, which is the 1.5 litres of a 360 gram AI glyphosate that you'll see on the label as one cardinal rate, but also even up at 4 litres. And what that looks like, this is photographs from that same testing, is as you can see on the bottom line, we have the sensitive standard, again very well controlled by 1.5 litres. The middle line is actually this reference population that we were supplied with from a confirmed and characterised case in Italy, where you can see 1.5 litres isn't killing the plants, maybe suppressing the fresh weight. 4 litres isn't killing the plants. And then on the top line is actually one of these samples from the field in Kent. So our glyphosate resistance in this scenario means that even the maximum usable label rates of glyphosate in this context are not controlled in this population. So obviously when we talk about resistance, sometimes we talk about definitions, whether it's tolerance or resistance. To be absolutely clear, when we talk about glyphosate resistance in Italian ryegrass, in terms of this first case, we're talking about no utility of glyphosate pre-drilling or crop destruction at the maximum usable rate. So very clear results. They're repeatable results now. We've gone through and carried out some confirmation testing against standards and against other seed populations. So what we are going to do in the immediate is, obviously, having identified the first population exhibiting glyphosate resistance, is make sure that we're in a position to offer that rapid testing of samples prior to drilling spring crops over the next few months. Partly because obviously we're going to have a period where people are much more aware of the problem, but partly to reassure people who've got concerns about their own Italian ryegrass populations. So start by discussing it with your normal agronomy service provider, ruling out there's a problem with a rate and obvious problems with glyphosate application. If you've gone through that process and you're seeing survivorship of individual Italian ryegrass plants of a good, appropriate application of glyphosate, we're going to have a rapid testing program where we ask you to complete a questionnaire that gives us some information that's relevant to us understanding the risk. And then the test is based on digging up whole plants live in the field, posting them to ADAS. And then rather than waiting for seed, we're going to be testing those plants as quickly as we can so that we can feed the information back to the grower and give them some appropriate advice around, as James said, reinforcing the messages around existing stewardship guidelines. So I think the emphasis that I would put is very much on taking action when you observe this particularly large, well-established Italian ryegrass plants surviving appropriate applications of glyphosate. Don't start by simply applying more glyphosate. Start by talking to your agronomist or considering yourself what possible reasons could there be for this failure. Repeat applications of glyphosate to plants that have survived in the initial application, and then establishing a crop without destroying those plants is going to lead to glyphosate resistance in field, and that's very much the message. So we'll deal, I think, with a lot of the obvious questions in a moment, but we really want to emphasise how important the stewardship of glyphosate is. We've taken glyphosate for granted as a tool for all sorts of scenarios, managing weeds on farm. We can't take it for granted any longer. So it's really appropriate that Roger comes in and gives us an overview of glyphosate stewardship, reinforce those messages.
Thank you, John. And you've also highlighted why we've structured today as we have, which is a direct contact with agronomists and also the farming press, so that the important role of agronomists in identifying these survivors and the cases and going through that process is so important in identifying these new cases if they exist, and that we don't jump to conclusions. Yeah. So we'll hand over to Roger, who is going to go through the latest glyphosate stewardship guidance, and particularly now it's even more relevant than it was before. Roger.
Thank you, James. That was a great introduction, John. So it falls to me just to talk a little bit about glyphosate stewardship and responsible use of glyphosate in the field so that we preserve efficacy for the longer term. So I think it's worth just first acknowledging all the sort of great work and diligent sort of work that John's been doing around confirming this as the first UK resistance case of glyphosate in a single field population of Italian ryegrass. I think, as John alluded to, resistance as a term is sort of bandied around quite lightly, but actually a true field case of resistance are relatively rare. And I think sort of reiterating the point John makes about sort of global experience really is that, and particularly within Europe, so 10, 15 years ago, there were these first cases of Italian ryegrass that were recognised in or reported within Europe, and actually that has not particularly spread or increased in terms of numbers. So these cases are entirely manageable. I think that sort of context and perspective really from elsewhere in the world is really important. And also reiterate, I think, the context John gave around the sheer number of samples that have been tested. Obviously, quite rightly, we're here today talking around this single first case or confirmed case of Italian ryegrass resistance in the UK. But what maybe doesn't get reported quite so widely is all of the other cases or all of the other samples which are tested and entirely susceptible to glyphosate. And as well as all the testing John talked about at ADAS and NIAB in the past, we also, as Bayer, have never found any populations from UK samples that we've screened and monitored that are of a concern to investigate further. And I think just on top of that, just to reiterate the point around the species. So John highlighted the risk in other grassweed species particularly, but currently to date, Italian ryegrass is the weed of focus really at the moment in terms of the species to which we've identified this first case. That's not to say that we shouldn't be concerned about other species. The risk still exists, but very much the Italian ryegrass is recognised as being the species perhaps most at risk in terms of resistance development. And I think the other point to make really is that despite this being the first case of UK resistance, glyphosate will continue to be a core pillar of IWM integrated weed management practice on farm, and that's absolutely still the experience elsewhere in the world where there are cases of resistance. Elsewhere, glyphosate still is the single biggest selling herbicide globally, and still has an important role to play, even in those geographies and countries where there are cases of glyphosate resistance. But I think this is obviously an important moment. This is an important announcement, and I think it should help focus all of our minds really on the need to focus on weed management at a field level, and that attention to detail that John sort of talked about, the vigilance that's necessary is really important. And it's quite right that it puts maybe a bit of a spotlight on the guidance which WRAG published, as James said, about 10 years ago now. So this is not new information that's being shared. This is information that's been in the public domain for some time. And if you take nothing else away from today, I think it's really important that all of us within the industry have a responsibility to shine a spotlight, I think, and increase our understanding and awareness and raise the importance of following the established guidance amongst the grower base and also importantly, particularly around application of glyphosate amongst spray operators who are in the field. So the plea really is to for growers and advisors and all of us in industry to engage with the published guidance to mitigate this risk of resistance appearing elsewhere. And I think it's important to highlight the point that the occurrence of resistance in the field is sort of directly related really to the farming practices that are implemented in that field. And there are certain farming systems that are very reliant obviously on glyphosate because there is limited soil movement, either direct drill or low till systems. And that's not to say that those systems can't exist. There are some really positive environmental, financial benefits to the grower around adopting those types of farming system, but I think they do require a bit of extra scrutiny and particular attention around sort of the detailed monitoring and vigilance around the appearance of suspicious plants in the field. So just to dip into the guidance a little bit, so this is a direct extract, and I think this little graphic is a really nice summary straight out of the guidelines for minimising the risk of glyphosate resistance in the UK. A really neat summary, really, of all of the actions that should be adopted, really, to minimise the risk of resistance development. And if we maybe just zoom out a little bit from talking about glyphosate specifically first, but zoom out a little bit in terms of the broader weed management needs. Clearly, some of the high-risk situations, as John sort of alluded to, are in those situations where we have really high grassweed pressure, where there's a lack of cultivation. Those are some of the situations where the risk of resistance development is highest. So there's a real need to obviously drive down, particularly in those situations, the weed numbers in individual fields, and that's why there needs to be this sort of attention to detail around tailoring weed control and weed management programs and strategies at a field level, not necessarily taking a view at a farm level, but focusing in on the detail where the problem areas are, and really taking sort of having a relentless focus around driving down weed numbers, because that where you have high weed populations in a field, there's obviously genetic diversity within that population. Application of a herbicide is not inducing resistance, but merely selecting for it. So if you have a high abundance of weeds, you get 99% control of 100 plants, you've got one survivor, one escape. If you have 99% control of 1,000 plants, that's 10 escapes. And so the chances, obviously, of individuals surviving in a particular field and more importantly, producing seed, which then obviously, if they are plants which are naturally less susceptible to an application of glyphosate, that's the source and the start of development of a resistant population. So focusing a little bit more on the particular guidance here, again, one of the key actions really is around maximising the efficacy of glyphosate in the field. And really that's around tailoring the dose, using the right dose for the weeds, the target weeds that you're applying to in the field. And also applying at the right time. So timeliness is really important. As for most herbicides, the best efficacy comes from treating weeds when they're small. Obviously, as weeds get larger and as we move into the spring, treating larger weeds is a more challenging target for any herbicide, and that includes glyphosate. So absolutely choosing the right dose rate and getting the timing right, really important for maximising the efficacy of glyphosate. And I think particularly around timing and spring applications, it's really worth remembering that growth stage 30, so this and beyond, this stem extension phase of growth is a really difficult growth stage for glyphosate. We know that during this phase of stem extension, as the plant is sort of moving the assimilates upwards, so the movement of nutrients and all of the sort of building blocks for the developing stem and ear and moving upwards in the plant, that's also the movement direction for the glyphosate. And so the risk is that you're not getting glyphosate down into the roots, and there's a real risk of regrowth. And that's why the recommendation really is very strongly around not applying during the stem extension phase of growth, which is obviously a risk during the springtime. An appropriate dose, again, really important around making sure that we achieve high levels of reliable efficacy with glyphosate. And you know, the dose rate that you put in the tank is not necessarily the dose rate that reaches the target site, and that's where application practice, I think, is really important to focus on and really a key area for consideration. So making sure that application of glyphosate is done in a timely way, yes, but also the quality of the application that's made is really thorough and careful. So going at low speeds, using the right nozzle for the application that you're trying to make, using the appropriate water volume, and if necessary, maybe using a water conditioner, because what you need to ensure is that you the dose rate of glyphosate you've chosen for that situation is the dose rate of glyphosate that's reaching the target. Use of alternatives, again, really important. So again, we know, and particularly in some of these farming systems which are very reliant on glyphosate for control, you know, those are sort of high-risk situations, and the use of alternative non-chemical methods of control, and we're familiar with many of those for managing some of the grassweed pressures that we have in fields already. But using alternative strategies to protect glyphosate is really important, and limiting that use intensity in those stale seed beds, really important to think about and plan strategic use of glyphosate to ensure that you're using it to best effect. It's then also really critical as we move around this circular diagram about monitoring success. So we've applied the herbicide in the field, but we need to monitor the success of the herbicide program. So, you know, the risk comes from not necessarily the escapes themselves, but those escapes or those survivors of the glyphosate application actually setting seed, and that is the part of the equation that you need to sort of keep an eye on and monitor. And I think, as we'll maybe talk about in a minute, but you know, there are, and as John has already alluded to, there have been cases where people have concerned they've got resistance in the field, but actually the performance of glyphosate is not affected as a result of resistance, but it's more other factors, so environmental factors or other factors which have impacted the performance of glyphosate. But really important to monitor and explain any failures or levels of poor control in the field, and really important, as I say, to prevent those survivors setting seed and providing the next or multiplying the problem potentially. So I thought it was just worth having also just a quick chat about glyphosate performance. So we've sort of talked about resistance, this case of resistance. As I say before, it's sort of talked about as a reason why glyphosate is not performing. And if we just cast our minds back to spring 2024, then, you know, for many reasons, this was a difficult spring for growing crops and for managing weeds. But it's just to draw and highlight, really, these are some of the factors that perhaps were influential, really, in compromising glyphosate efficacy during last season. So the two at the top are probably the most important, really. So we've talked about them already, dose rate and timing. And I think one of our experiences from last season was that, you know, quite unavoidably, the weather was awful. There were very few opportunities for timely glyphosate applications in the early part of the spring. So recommendations were left on farm in all good faith. But perhaps some of and certainly in our experience, some of those weeds were, by the time those applications were made, actually perhaps required a higher dose of glyphosate to control them. So as we've talked about earlier, controlling small weeds is best. But in this scenario where weed control is unavoidably delayed, then really important that as advisors and growers that we sort of review the recommendations and choose the appropriate dose of glyphosate to apply. And in terms of the timing, so again, you know, a lot of the applications were delayed sort of into March and April time when those grass weeds are moving into that stem extension phase of growth. And we've already talked about the fact this is a critical time, a difficult sort of time for glyphosate. It's not, the capacity for regrowth is really high. So particularly where other factors are suboptimal and soil moisture isn't limiting, which was certainly not the case last season, then, you know, all of these factors can conspire to support plant recovery. So we've talked about maybe the two main factors, but there's obviously a lot of other factors feeding into this, and one of those last year was wet fields. So obviously saturated fields, anaerobic conditions, really stressed crops. You know, that stunted the growth of plants. It limited the translocation of the glyphosate within those plants. So again, we're not necessarily getting the dose of glyphosate that's gone in the spray tank to where it needs to be to do the job. So all of these sort of factors are sort of cumulative and maybe different by different scenarios, but all of these factors can sort of influence the performance of glyphosate. I think it's also fair to say that, you know, there was pressure in terms of spray days last spring. So again, there were very few days sort of without rainfall during that early spring period. So rain fastness was certainly an issue in some cases. And again, for very good reasons, there's lots of sort of conflicting objectives and conflicting sort of workload priorities on farm. You know, spray windows were tight, and there was a necessity really to get around and keep work rates up. But really important to consider for maximising the efficacy of glyphosate that application is sort of is well considered and is taken care. So keeping speed, keeping forward speeds down. Choosing the right nozzle for the job you're trying to achieve, and again, applying in sort of conditions which are not going to compromise activity. So all of that can conspire, and particularly under suboptimal environmental conditions, to limit the performance of glyphosate. We've all quite rightly talked today and focused really on arable cropping, but I think it's worth just also mentioning that glyphosate is used in a number of other settings, and particularly pick out here perennial crops. We know from elsewhere in the world this is also a high-risk scenario, high reliance on glyphosate, not necessarily other modes of action used within these settings, no soil movement. So really important to, particularly in these horticultural and perennial crop type settings, to focus on glyphosate, think about how it's being used, and where possible incorporate alternatives. But again, vigilance really key in terms of the need to look out for survivors and manage those plants that in a different way to avoid them setting seed. And similarly in an amenity setting, glyphosate again really widely used for managing weeds on some of our key infrastructure, and so again, really a professional approach needed here in terms of applying the glyphosate well, planning a weed control program, applying it at the right time, using the right dose for the species you're trying to manage, and again, a need to sort of monitor the success of that application. So whether that's a follow-up or a record keeping of maybe where there's been challenging patches or survivors, and I know that's practically quite difficult, but the same rules apply really in terms of choosing the right approach to manage those problems. So just to sort of sum up really and finish, I think as Bayer as a key supplier of glyphosate into the market, it's really important to remember that glyphosate is a unique non-selective herbicide. So yes, it's a non-selective herbicide, but different weeds are differentially tolerant to glyphosate naturally. So different doses are needed to control particular weed species. I think that's really important to remember. I think we need to also be aware, and in the past, where we've had problems with resistance, there's always been this reliance on the R&D manufacturer community to come up with a new mode of action, a new product to solve a problem. And as we're all aware that is increasingly difficult. And as Bayer, we're not aware of any true glyphosate replacements in development. So really important that we retain and sustain the efficacy and performance of glyphosate in the UK market. And just to say that Bayer are committed to support the long-term future of glyphosate and really committed to promote the awareness of the established and the published stewardship guidance, which is available from WRAG. So again, if you do nothing else after today, I'd really encourage you to go and familiarise yourself with the guidance and take the opportunity to sort of spread the word this guidance exists and encourage adoption and uptake of the published guidance which is available. And again, we as Bayer will take, will continue to support growers and advisors with that practical best practice advice in order to sustain the long-term future and viability of glyphosate. And I think just as a final sort of word really, and we've sort of touched on it already, but I think the global experience certainly of us at Bayer is that in markets where resistance has already developed, glyphosate management is really important, and it continues to be a really a vital tool to help growers manage their weeds.
Thank you very much, Roger, and also for John earlier on. So I now need to go offline or stop the presentation and find the Q&A, which I think have started coming in. So while I'm going offline, I'm going to ask you both to expand on a point you've made, which is John's already highlighted Italian ryegrass was already a high-risk weed. If we're looking at other weeds, but also other situations, you first, John, where should people be most focusing their effort in terms of worrying what they're currently doing and assessing it?
Yeah, so where we have a reliance on glyphosate because it isn't balanced by high level of, for example, non-chemical weeding through cultivation, giving mechanical weeding, or integrated weed management, reducing the pressure in terms of numbers, which is something Roger focused on. And you are very reliant on total weed control with glyphosate without any mechanical weeding to transition between crops or from cover crops into crops or into planting cover crops. That's the real high risk. And what we see where we're beginning to see these populations of concern and this individual confirmed case is where without sufficient mechanical weeding cultivation between crops, planting spring crops where the Italian ryegrass is much larger, well-tillered, lots of foliage, without any mechanical weeding at the point of drilling. So you're using a low disturbance drill. So you are very, very reliant on the glyphosate performance to get you into the spring crop. And then we see survivorship in that scenario, very high selection level, and that seems to be the problem. But to be absolutely clear, because we're kind of alluding to a regenerative conservation agriculture no-till system, we are not saying that the identification of the first case in the UK of glyphosate resistance is any reason for the industry not to continue to adopt regenerative and conservation agricultural practices. But what we are saying is people must understand, at least in the transition phase, that system puts a lot more pressure on glyphosate, and that transition must be accompanied by a much higher level of vigilance and reacting to failures of glyphosate in the field and considering bringing in alternatives when they're needed, because we know that's a very high risk scenario.
Thank you. Roger?
No, I'd agree with sort of everything John said, really. That population management, I think, is really key. Where we have high population numbers, whatever the species, I think that's really important. I mean, obviously the key, we're talking today about Italian ryegrass, but I think John alluded to other species, other grassweed species. We don't have any confirmed cases of resistance in the UK, despite the monitoring and screening that we've already done. But, quite clearly, John alluded to the fact that there are other species which do represent a risk. Their biology is such that, they are prolific seed producers. So if you do allow them to set seed, then, huge numbers of seed being returned to the soil, and that in itself represents a sort of a high risk type scenario.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So we've got a question here which relates really to probably mainly the amenity use, but also highlights that this is a publicly available product as well in garden centres, so garden use as well. And the more extreme you get, we know it's harder to monitor what people are achieving and doing. But they will use and have a much lower understanding sometimes in those sectors. So how do we ensure that we get best practice in those amenity sectors in particular, and probably the home and garden sector as well? And it might be helpful, Roger, if you could outline what Bayer and other manufacturers, because you're not the only manufacturer, obviously, are planning to do or already doing in those sectors.
So, no, really, really good question. And I think, we've had a challenge, haven't we, around disseminating best practice advice. And I think for me, actually, it's getting, so we talk a lot about it. And as Bayer, particularly, I don't want to talk on behalf of other manufacturers, but certainly as Bayer, we have been really clear about disseminating best practice advice within the arable sector. But I think as we all recognise here, the horticulture sector, the amenity sector have probably been a little bit neglected. And so I think we just need to be better at trying to get those messages out to the right audience. And how will we go about doing that? I think we need to perhaps give some more consideration to. It is a more disparate, particularly once we start talking about the amateur market, a much more disparate and difficult population to communicate with, partly because they don't understand necessarily the risks in what they're doing. But yeah, it really does need a lot more focus on, and I think we do need to be better as an industry at trying to communicate and engage with those end users who are using the products.
Yeah. I mean, the other use case where which you point to is the use in scenarios like orchard and vineyard. So you've got perennial crops where this risk of, maybe not intentionally, but you're treating the same plant repeatedly with glyphosate, and particularly with a species like Italian ryegrass, which is capable, it's an annual, but you can have the same Italian ryegrass plant that you're treating over and over again over a number of years. So we do. I mean, I think we should recognise, and we should be positive, that actually in arable crop production we are well served by a very well skilled agronomy workforce. And I noticed that there's a question. So Andrew Blasey has asked a question as the chair of AICC, and that perhaps brings in, that's particularly relevant because, as I said, we are well served. And as I highlighted when we talked about the identification of this case, our experience has been that we're homing in on these very high risk scenarios through the expertise that's out there in the agronomy sector. And I'm convinced that we're going to continue to need that expertise to help us not just promote and develop better practice, but to identify the problems going forward. And as Andrew makes the point in his question, it's worth noting that we will be talking about glyphosate resistance and the future of glyphosate in a lot more detail at their meeting at their conference next week. So we'll have a couple of hours to really have a question and answer and talk to agronomists about how the questions that they would like to ask and what they think their customers are going to ask. And it's probably worth highlighting that as a resource as well, because we'll have a little bit more time to talk about it.
Well, I think that's a fortunate coincidence of timing, and it's an opportunity to engage with all of that audience directly, or the individual agronomists of AICC direct in that case. And I hope through engaging the wider audience on this call, we can also pick up all of those of you who in your companies are engaging with horticulture and amenity, and we can think through how collectively we can do something that is more informed and better and helps highlight those high risks, especially in horticulture, where we know those perennial crops and vineyards are two of the highest risk global scenarios where resistance cases occur. So there's a question here about a bit more about sampling sizing and the way it needs to be presented when being sent in, which I think it would probably be helpful, John, if you can say a bit about what the principles. What I think we should say straight off is that the details of how that sampling will be worked out, the triage assessment form and the way in which we would receive those samples will be announced later once it's been finalised. But the principles you could certainly expand on. I think.
So in terms of how individual growers and advisors might access the sampling, it will be through colleagues like Mark, who in this case leads the NIAD membership, so through the normal agronomy advice route. Because we think the priority is quick turnaround rather than accuracy, we want to offer a plant-based test. So we are going to ask growers to both fill out a questionnaire that gives us an indication of risk and will help us to understand and home in a little bit better in the future, to dig up some plants in the field which have survived an attempt to control them with glyphosate, to bag them up and to put them in the post to ADAS. We're going to need obviously a sufficient quantity of individual plants to have a bit of repetition. So we're probably going to, the precise answer will come in time, but we're probably looking at about a dozen plants or clump or something like that. We will communicate via colleagues like Mark and through other agronomy service providers how to access this testing and exactly what's required over the next few weeks.
Yeah, thank you. So we apologise. We sort of foresaw the question, but we can't give you the full details, but they will be available through all the normal channels and certainly on our RAG websites and channels, and I'll put those up again on a slide at the end in case you want them. But there's a question really which is about going wider to directly to farmers here. What plans are there for further getting directly to farmers, not just through their advisors? I think we all know the importance of advisors, and I guess some of this comes the other way. What support would advisors like when engaging with their farmer clients as well? It would be useful for us to know that so that we can help make that available. And the correct question correctly points out that not all failures are due to due to resistance. A lot of them are due to bad application practice. So it's probably one for you, Roger, on what you as a company are doing and or no other companies are also doing to promote best practice guidance.
I mean, obviously as a company, we most of our we don't have direct channels necessarily to the broad farming public. Our advice, or the advice, if you like, to farm goes through the independent agronomists or distributor agronomists, as John sort of highlights highly trained people who themselves have the knowledge, and absolutely it's a question internally we do wrestle with about how we get the information out to the end user, who's ultimately the spray operator. So yes, we can have good conversations with a farmer or a farm manager, but they're not necessarily the people who are making the application. And I think maybe this announcement today is maybe a good springboard to sort of reinvigorate a conversation and generate some content around the need and the importance to follow the guidance. And this is why it's important that for every farming business, it's important to follow the guidance and what the consequences are of not doing so.
Yeah,
but absolutely, I totally recognise the challenge, and a really important one for us to get to grips with.
I mean, I think a starting point is, and it's why we're going to make the video of this meeting available. There's a bullet point summary on the RAG website. We're also going to work with AICC for the longer form video, which really digs into this in more depth, available, because I think a starting point for that communication and education is to make sure we've all got the same messages, and we're not going off on one group saying this is the end of regen, another group saying, well, we just need higher rates, we all need to share responsibility for the same set of consistent messages about good practice, vigilance, monitoring, taking action where appropriate, and not have that message splintered in any way. So that's our starting point. But I think we do need to then go on and have a really difficult conversation about how do we communicate, particularly to farmers who've not engaged as much as maybe others have in the advice that is available.
Yeah, and I think there's an action for us both as a group but within RAG to directly engage with the Amenity Forum, and also to directly engage with the sprayer and application test training and basis to make sure that they're now also fully aware of this, and that gets incorporated and updated into courses, which we'll take away. So thank you for raising that. There's a question here from Hazel about engaging with the livestock sector where lays are sprayed off, but also with ryegrass seed crop growers and advisors. Is there anything either of you want to say on what those risks already known are, and perhaps where there's something we should be doing more on in those two sectors? They're quite different groups of people, of course, but it's the people spraying off grass lays in the livestock sector or those growing seed crops.
Yeah, I mean, that is a difficult question we're going to have to wrestle with. So at the moment, let's put this in perspective. We've identified a single case down in Kent. We've done a lot of screening. There is a theoretical risk, and this is where it comes into the seed production and seed supply chain of getting some contamination of the ryegrass seed supply chain. But it's only a theoretical risk. I think as Hazel implies, this is a problem that's going to cut right across the industry. And we had a question from the chair of AICC, and Hazel represents AIC. We've got manufacturers, we've got advice sector companies listening in today, as well as a lot of the people involved in commercial activity in agriculture. Glyphosate resistance, is, as you can see by the question, is going to cut across all those sectors, and we do need to come together. Yeah. But in particular in the seed supply industry, we do have protections through seed certification and all those processes. I think we are going to have to reflect on whether we need to add additional protections as a result of this observation, but not throwing out some of the existing structures that have performed and served us so well over so many years.
Yeah, but I think if you, Hazel, or AIC colleagues have got comments on how we could engage better with those, we'd certainly like to hear that, please. Anything you want to add?
No, I think you covered the position well. I think, it's important for us all as industry to sort of, yes, we as a manufacturer have responsibilities here. We're keen to engage with it, but, we don't necessarily have all of the ideas. So please, if others have ways of and thoughts about how we can better engage with the end user, that's great.
So there's one last question I think I'm going to take, because there's not a huge number flooding in, and we said we'd finished at 12:15. Are there? Okay. But it's sort of related to that, about if glyphosate resistance is confirmed on a farm, how will it be contained on that site, and what advice might the person who's got it have to follow? And I think if I was going to say one thing we've learned over the years, getting on top of it when you first, if you actually have only one plant and you take that one plant away and destroy it, you've solved the problem in the immediate. And actually those early days are the really most important ones. So anything, John, you want to say in response to that question?
I mean, I think in terms of the specific farm, to be absolutely clear, we will not identify details about the farm, and that's really important. We will always deal, and I know not just ADAS but other organisations, we will always deal with individuals who think they've got problems on the basis of total confidentiality, and we'll respect that confidentiality no matter what the outcome. I will say that in the farm in Kent, both the owner, the advisor who's on farm, and the operator who's on farm, their response to this has been exemplary in terms of their focus on local biosecurity, talking to surrounding farmers, and really making sure that in that single farm, we are really making sure that we confine the problem to its existing footprint. Again, by taking responsibility for things like machinery movement at farm of vehicles, individuals, communicating with neighbours so the neighbours know the urgency of taking action if they see Italian ryegrass coming into their fields. So locally, in that individual case, there is a massive biosecurity responsibility, which I can only emphasise how exemplary the response has been from the individuals on the ground there, which should be a reassurance to all of us. In terms of what the farmer is doing to continue to produce arable crops, we are talking about introducing or reintroducing more mechanical weeding. It still continues to use glyphosate, so you can see from the picture, even with glyphosate resistance, the glyphosate is probably still killing 99% or 90% plus of the individuals. It's the survivors which are the problem. So he continues to use glyphosate, but he's brought in a lot of mechanical weeding to help him continue to grow crops. The other thing that I would say, which reflects other observations that we've made around changes in glyphosate sensitivity, if not resistance, is that where we are finding reduced sensitivity to glyphosate, and in this case resistance, it is not associated with high levels of resistance to in-crop selective herbicides. Now, that may or may not be, there may or may not be a causal link. It's a very useful observation for the individual on the ground because he's using selectives in the crop very successfully alongside more mechanical weeding. But it also is a really powerful message to other farmers and advisors. The selection for glyphosate tolerance and then resistance is not confined to growers who already have herbicide-resistant ryegrass to in-crop herbicides. It demonstrably can be selected for completely independently of those other resistance characteristics. So just because you don't have problematic ryegrass, herbicide-resistant ryegrass, doesn't mean you are immune to this glyphosate resistance or reducing performance from glyphosate if you do not understand the stewardship and the messages that we're putting out.
Anything to add, John? Roger, to what John
said?
I
think that's a very comprehensive answer. I mean, I think the point you made, James, about sort of early vigilance, early detection of these cases is really important because, obviously once it's spread, it becomes much more difficult to manage and contain. So.
Okay, I'm just so there are a couple of comments in there which I'm going to they're really comments rather than questions, but thank you to those who made them. I'm keen that we finish about when we said we would do. I really just want to summarise and make sure that you've got the relevant sources of the information to hand, but to confirm that we have today confirmed the first case of high risk in a high-risk situation in Italian ryegrass. And it's exactly why we wrote the guidelines, to try and prevent that risk and particular risk of developing elsewhere. And that strategy is still robust in those guidelines, and they are on our website. Absolutely critical will be the monitoring, and all of you in terms of what happens on your clients' farms and businesses. And we will be communicating how to seek that further investigation, and we will communicate that through all the normal agronomy channels and our RAG channels, which you can see and join up to before. We will also make the information and links to this meeting recording widely available. That should be around the middle of next week. I believe that the recording should be available. You will already find on the RAG website a 2-page document from RAG which highlights the things that have been discussed today, which you can make widely available within your networks. But I would like to just finish by thanking you all for joining us today and taking some time out. This was a day I guess we sort of knew we would one day come across. I think it's actually quite important. We've got 10 years down the road, and the one we have found ticks all the boxes for being high risk. So that is reassuring, and I think we've got a lot of confidence that the measures in those guidelines, supported by research that has been done by AHDB and by industry, manufacturers and distributive trade, is really helpful to us. So I'd like to thank my colleagues at ADAS, particularly John and Katie, who've done a lot of the work, and also to colleagues in Bayer and Roger for joining us and helping support some of what we've been able to communicate. Thank you all very much. Have a pleasant end of your day or rest of your day. And hopefully, if you do want to engage with us and help you in supporting information, please contact either RAG or any of the manufacturers direct who can support you in your activities. Thank you all.